to have Professor Raewyn Connell be part of this seminar series. Dr. Raewyn Connell is Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney and a life member of the National Tertiary Education Union. She took a bachelor honors degree at the University of Melbourne and a PhD from the University of Sydney. As a sociologist, class dynamics and on how class and gender hierarchies are made and remade in the everyday life of schools. In several of her books, including Gender and Power, Gender in World Perspective, she develops a social theory of gender relations, which emphasizes that gender is a large-scale and dynamic social structure and not merely an issue of personal identity. Professor Connell is one of the founders of Masculinities as a research field, and her book known in the field. She has also been concerned with the politics of intellectual life, gradually developing a sociology of intellectuals that focuses on the labor process of knowledge formation and knowledge circulation. She has critiqued the northern bias of mainstream social science and the colonial structures of knowledge. Her 2007 book, Southern Theory, discusses intellectuals and social theories from the global periphery and explores paths towards knowledge democracy on a world scale. Today, she'll be speaking to us about her 2019 book, The Good University, which is a very relevant, timely, auspicious contribution, I think, given that so much has happened to and in universities, and we now need some schooling on how universities work and what alternative features there could be for them. Welcome again, Dr. Raewyn Connell. We look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Lovely, thank you very much. I have a little PowerPoint with some illustrations, so I will attempt to screen share. Thus, and I hope that is coming through properly.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm honoured to have the chance to speak with you and to hear your thoughts on issues that have been very important to me and for a long time. I'll just try to make the PowerPoint work. There we are. This is the, which many of you will have seen, the Z Books edition of my book. It was also published separately in Australia. And although it draws on themes from a lot of my previous work, as I'll say in a moment, it was actually triggered by, the decision to write it was triggered by a particular event, which you can see here. It was a strike back in the year 2013, very much near the end of my academic career, just a couple of years before I formally retired. It arose out of somewhat aggressive actions from our university management at the time when a wages and conditions contract was being negotiated in a number of actions which angered the staff, including faculty of the university, so much that we voted for strike action. And here is a picture of the scale of the event, a march from a strike meeting to protest outside the then administration building. I spent some time on the picket line in that strike. And as those of you who've been on strike will know, being on the picket line has some moments of great excitement. For instance, when the New South Wales Police riot squad turned up at our picket. But there are also long periods of boredom on a picket line, so they give you time to think. And in that time to think, I reflected on what had been happening and thought it was really time for our workforce and our union to stop being defensive and to be more proactive in proposing agendas for the kind of university and university system that we would like to see, rather than always just reacting to the latest problems created by management. So that was I thought I should put my money where my mouth is, and that was the trigger, if you like, to putting together my thoughts on universities and knowledge work and knowledge workers in the form of this book. So in doing that, I drew on the research that you've already heard mentioned, thank you, about intellectuals and intellectual work, the research that went back to my work on intellectuals in the Global South, about different knowledge formations, the industrial struggles in universities, but also to my own history of involvement in progressive education experiments. And particularly, I suppose, right back to the beginning, before the time I was still a graduate student back in the 1960s, I was very much involved in an attempt to set up an experimental university in Sydney, which we called, in the language of the day, the Free University of Sydney, which ran for several years with student-directed courses and an experimental curriculum. A really very exciting experience, and lessons from which I carried through into my work in the various universities where I have taught and researched. Okay, that's my background and the resources that I brought to this. I'd like to sketch the line of argument and illustrate some points from it. In the opening chapters of the book, I talk about research and teaching as forms of labor, as forms of work, which is, a common sense idea, I suppose, but nevertheless goes missing in a lot of talk about research and teaching, the actual work that's involved, how that is organized and controlled, and what's the character of the workforce that does it. So in the first chapter, I talk about the nature of research as the work of knowledge production and circulation, and suggest a way of understanding the different components of that labour process. In the second chapter, I try to do the same for the process of teaching in higher education, drawing to some extent on the work of the great Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky, whom I'm sure many of you will know the work, but also trying to connect that with the, if you like, the industrial and organizational conditions of work in higher education. And then chapter 3 is an attempt to characterize the nature of the higher education workforce, the way the daily operations of the university actually function, rather than the various mythologies about that work that circulate, what it looks like from the ground up. And in that, I make several key points, I think, in those chapters, in that opening part of the book. First of all, that the work of universities is a composite labour process. It involves a variety of different forms of work, which have to be stitched or woven or knitted together to get the effects of producing knowledge and of higher education. And that's a complex thing which actually is organised and coordinated above all from below, not from above. It's through the daily inventiveness, cooperation and exchange of the different groups of university workers that the university works as an organisation and produces knowledge and engages in higher education. So the cooperation of the different parts of the workforce is absolutely vital to the labour processes in universities. So the diversity and relationships in a diverse workforce is crucial to understanding universities. And one very important part of that, which academics often forget, I'm sorry to say, is that half of the university workforce are non-academic workers. They're professional workers, maintenance workers, support workers, clerical workers, technical staff. And so that is a full half of the university workforce, and they are just as important as the academics to the capacities of universities to produce knowledge and to engage in higher education. So that I argue very strongly that we must concern ourselves with the conditions of work and life for all the university workforce if we are to have good universities. In the next chapters of the book, I talk about, if you like, the broad social context of university work. And I do that around two themes. One is what I call the global economy of knowledge, which is the concept that has come out of my work on Southern theory, out of the work especially of the African philosopher Pauline Ntonji, who's one of my intellectual heroes, and the decolonial and post-colonial studies that have come out of South Asia and Latin America in the last generation. I then talk about the questions of social justice in higher education, the way universities have historically functioned as what I call privilege machines, as forms of access to different kinds of privilege, to professional work, to state authority, and so forth, and the various ways that has been contested. And I mentioned there the very important history of women's engagement in higher education, given that before the middle of the 19th century, universities were essentially masculine institutions, often with women's participation formally forbidden. So a long social struggle in many countries over the last 100, 150 years has changed that to the point where in many countries, including Australia, women are now a majority of university students and an increasing presence in the academic workforce, as well as their presence in what I call the operations staff of universities. So the key points in this part of the book, I would say, is that we have to engage with problems of world inequality, in which universities are active in producing inequality. One must confess that, uncomfortable as it is, in producing inequalities of gender, of class, of race, of ethnicity, but where those inequalities are also capable of being contested. And at this point, I'd like to illustrate that from a couple of recent contestations, which in their own way highlight the continuing problems of social justice in the university system. This is from South Asia, from India, a picture of a demonstration at the University of Hyderabad just a couple of years ago, when a conflict arose over caste inclusion and exclusion, caste privilege and exclusion, which came to a head with the suicide of one of the Dalit students in that university, and suffered from bullying and exclusion, and triggered a series of protests about the situation of Dalit students and the need for proper support and engagement by universities as institutions. The second example I want to mention is from South Africa. This is a picture from a couple of years ago of one of the early demonstrations of the Fees Must Fall movement. This is in Cape Town, outside the Parliament building, where a national campaign was sparked around the proposal to increase what were already unmanageable levels of fees for the majority of students in the South African university system, which is stratified still a generation after the apartheid system, in class terms, in racial terms, and which is currently, an enormously contested area. So, I mean, those are only two examples of many that could be given of the struggles that continue around access to higher education. In the next section of the book, which consists of one chapter, I engage with the issue which has been debated, all around the world, and about which there is now big literature, and that is the shift from a public service model of universities to a corporate model under neoliberal policy regimes, where universities have been reconstructed to a significant extent on the model of profit-making corporations, whether they remain nominally in public sector or are placed in the private sector. That model of an organisation has become the dominant model worldwide, where and indeed in at least some parts of the world, the private sector, privately owned universities now account for a majority of the students in higher education. That is the case, for instance, in Brazil. In India, the statistics I've seen suggest that proportion has risen to about half of students in the sector nationwide. And the increase of private universities has been going on also in China on a significant scale, though not quite at that level. So this is a global development, even though it's most extensively debated in the global north, where, of course, some of its roots lie in the history of elite private universities in the United States. Okay, well, the key points that I'm making in my discussion of this much debated issue about universities are these. Firstly, that a crucial internal change in universities happens with the advent of neoliberal privatization, corporate policy regime. And that is a shift of decision-making power from the university staff more broadly into a very specific group of senior managers now called managers, where once upon a time they were called university administrations, and who have come to model themselves on the managerial elites of large private sector profit-making corporations. In fact, that has been accompanied by a retraining of university administrators conducted to some extent by private sector corporations, a very significant shift in the culture of higher education has been accomplished. And this has some notable symbols. For my money, this is one of the most striking. When we went on strike back in 2013 at the University of Sydney and went on that march, we marched to the old building in the university where management was still centred. But since then, management has built itself a managerial palace. And here is the architect's picture of the managerial palace at the new major entry to the university, with one of the older research buildings behind. And that is now a securitized building, which you would not be surprised to find on the campus of Microsoft or Standard Oil or any corporation you care to mention. But the change in organizational form has also been accompanied by a change in the university's relationships with the outside world. And here's an example of that from my alma mater, the University of Melbourne, which now engages in advertising, as most Australian universities and many globally do, in advertising, which sort of boasts of more or less spurious achievements, in this case coming in the first position in some pretty bad league table, which, as all education researchers know, are hardly worth the paper they're printed on in terms of real knowledge. But this increasingly systematic misrepresentation of universities by themselves through advertising, promotion of one kind or another deeply disturbs me, because if universities have any claim to respect in society and any claim on public funds, it's because we are concerned with truth. We attempt to produce truths about the world through research, and all researchers know how difficult it is, but that is what we are trying to do. So for university managements to come along and start, campaigns representing the universities through untruths and easily recognizable advertising guff, that seems to me a very dangerous development. So what are the alternatives? Well, that's the subject of the last two chapters of the book, chapters 7 and 8, where I first of all talk about the very rich history of alternative, experimental and progressive universities, which is not actually very widely known, and which I think ought to be. So that might even be the most important chapter of the book, that I'm trying to recover this, to some extent, hidden history of fascinating reform-oriented experimental universities. And I want to illustrate just one of those. I mean, I could tell you about many. This is from India. This is a photograph taken back around 1920. And it's at the launch of a new college, which was set up at the initiative of the great Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, I'm sure most of you know, who was an educational researcher as well as an amazing writer of poetry, novels, essays, and so forth, who set up experimental schools, finally argued that the university system that had been created under British colonisation was oriented to the, and this is of course correct, criticism, oriented to the needs of the colonial regime and oriented to the authority of the colonising power, that is Britain. And you needed something else in India. You needed a college that certainly would be based in the knowledge, practices and cultures of the Indian subcontinent, but also which would be not a monocultural curriculum, but a meeting place for different world civilizations. Really exciting, ambitious notion. And this was the college that was set up. It's called Visva Bharati. It still exists. After I mean, like all experimental universities, it had trouble with funding and so forth, but it survived and is now recognized as a university within the Indian public education system. That's just one of literally dozens of really interesting experimental, progressive and democratic universities that we should know about and realize are a resource for us to build on. And then in the final chapter, I talk about possible futures and the resources for hope. And one of the resources that I identify, and I think should be always in our mind, is the amount of public support there really is out there for good, publicly accessible higher education and university systems. So the last picture I want to show you is an illustration of that from Chile in South America. Some years back, about 10, 12 years ago, there was a student movement. Chile has a strongly privatized university system and a highly unequal one in class terms. There was a student movement in favor of public education, public higher education. They called a rally in the middle of Santiago, the capital city, and nearly 1 million people turned up to that rally in favor of public higher education. Now that's a dramatic, I don't think we would get quite such a crowd in Australia, but there is a great well of support for good public higher education, which can be built on. So that's the story of the book. I'm just going to wind up with a little bit of self-criticism, apart from going on a little bit too long right now. But my own criticisms of the book, reflecting on it after a couple of years, is that I might have been in the book a bit too kind to the privileged groups, including, for instance, senior academics like me. I think it has been unfortunately possible for senior academics to be bystanders in many of the struggles that have occurred in and around universities, and that needs to be addressed. I think one of the features of the corporate turn in universities has been an increasing amount of corruption in universities. As universities become profit-making organizations, the chances and temptation and culture of corruption becomes easier. And I don't think I gave enough recognition in the text of the book to the structural racism of the global economy of knowledge. So that I think is implicit. So those are criticisms I would make. And the last point I would make is that, my last criticism, is that my suggestions about the future of universities in chapter 8 are very generalized. Now that was inevitable, I suppose, in a book that was addressed to an international order, an international audience, dealing with many different university systems. But in trying to turn any such ideas into practice, we do need to touch down in the hard realities of particular university systems and engage in struggle at the level of political policies and the actual industrial politics of the university sector. It's probably an unavoidable weakness of a book like this, but I didn't really intend it as a cookbook. I hope it will be a source of ideas that are of use to people engaged in a variety of different changes and processes. Okay, thank you. That's enough from me. And I'm now very happy to turn it over to you. And I'll get off the screen, I hope.
Okay. Well,
Right.
thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the breathtakingly beautiful presentation. It's given us quite a bit of food for thought. And I'll hand over now to Sinfree to pose a couple of questions. Sinfree, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Percy. Thank you very much, Professor Connell. I have a couple of questions. And the first question I want to ask, it deals with the nature conceptually of the relationship between your work and, let's say, the work by people like Bonaventura dos Santos, who also deal with issues about Southern epistemologies. In what way do you think your work is similar or different from Bonaventura dos Santos' work?
Sure. Do you want to go on with the second question now too? And I'll respond.
I'll move on to the second question. Yeah. Yeah, if you can just answer that question, then I will move on to the second.
Okay, sure. Yes, I know Bonaventura dos Santos's work, and I greatly respect it. I've learnt from it. And I likewise have become acquainted with the work of the wider decolonial school in Latin America and in North America. And I have studied the work of post-colonial scholarship, much of which comes, as you will know, from South Asia. And I've been greatly interested in the work which doesn't have a familiar title in the same way that comes from Africa, in the work of people like Pauline Ntonji and Ashia Mbembe. So I enormously respect their work, such as Mbembe's most recent, not most recent, but fairly recent book, The Critique of Black Reason, which is a wonderful and incredibly broad-ranging exploration. So yes, I have tried to learn from all of these groups, and I think it's it's really quite important, in fact, that critiques and alternatives are emerging from several different directions. What might be different about my work is a couple of things. My work comes to considerable extent from a sociological background, from a concern with the sociology of knowledge. So I have been influenced also by more classical sociology of knowledge writers like Georg Lukács, Karl Mannheim, from several generations ago, and as well as the examples of struggle and the construction of new concepts and new frameworks which have come around the global south, come from around the global south in anti-colonial struggles, especially. I think also I've been, my work tends to differ from theirs in being very much interested in the nature of universities, research centres and research institutions, libraries, journals and so forth, as institutions, as organisations. This also comes a bit from a sociological background, but it directs me very much to think about the workforces that are involved in the creation of knowledge and the colonial and decolonial history of our workforces. So how, for instance, university workforces were created in colonial contexts and what knowledge practices were created in colonial universities and how they have, and to some extent have not, been changed with decolonisation and the creation of new political frameworks. So that's a side of university life, I guess, that I tend to stress more than the decolonial and post-colonial writers mostly do.
Okay, then my second question is this. What I found quite striking about your book, The Good University, is the emphasis on the academic researchers, the teachers, etc. But I thought you didn't adequately discuss the impact of universities on students. So from your own experiences, what do universities actually do to students about their sense of self-perception and worth? I can understand what universities do to people like me, etc., and all that, but what about to actual students?
Yeah. It's very, very, very complicated. And I'll need to organize my thoughts a bit. I think one of the really problematic impacts of universities, of mainstream universities, is, what in debates about schools is called the hidden curriculum. So that universities are organised hierarchically, or mainstream universities are organised hierarchically, with a clear distinction between staff and students, between academic staff and students as learners, with authority placed on the side of the university and lack of authority, lack of knowledge attributed to the students. And of course, that's refined because of the hierarchy in universities, where there are senior academics who are supposed to know much, much more than the junior academics, and sometimes do and often don't. So the university then confronts the students with a kind of delegitimation process almost, and places them in a position where they have to satisfy the demands of hierarchical superiors. Now that whole process is anti-democratic to me, and it's actually not good for learning. I mean, if the task of universities in relation to students is to foster their capacity to learn, then you don't do that by disempowering them organisationally. You do that by providing resources, by engaging with them, by recognising them as people with knowledge and with capacities in their own right, and bringing a cooperative process of learning and development into existence, in which the students are very active members. So that's one kind of critique I would make of the universities. I mean, it's part of that, I suppose, also, that mainstream universities have a very narrow idea of what legitimate knowledge is. That is, they work only within one episteme, one as I call it in the Good University, one knowledge formation. Yet we know there are other knowledge formations in the world, other knowledge frameworks ranging from indigenous knowledges through alternative universalisms, such as Islamic jurisprudence, for instance. We know there are local knowledges of great importance. I think a good higher education, much as Rabindranath Tagore argued, although he used a different language for this, of course, back in his day, but he did argue that a good university should be, as he put it, a place for the meeting of civilizations. And I think that is still true. We might frame it differently and say multicultural, in a place where more than one knowledge formation is at work. But that, I think, is one of the ways we make higher education exciting to students and a genuine contribution to global culture. Yeah.
Good. Let me stop here so that we can open up the discussion. I can always get back to you with more questions.
Sure.
Thank you very much. So together with Basi, we are going to, and Visnia, we are going to moderate this part. I would like to just jump out of order because the question made by Francis is very relevant to what Dr. Connell was just saying. So Francis Vabrus says that students at one of our most elite private universities, Columbia, have begun a tuition strike today. There is a link and there's a question. As a senior academic myself, what specific roles do you see for us in supporting students in such efforts without co-opting them?
Yeah, I don't think there's too much danger of academics co-opting students when a fee strike is underway. I didn't raise the issue of student debt in my very quick run through, but it was there. It is indeed a huge problem. Globally, student debt now is in the trillions of dollars. It's a monster problem, and as we saw in the case of the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa, it's capable of generating very considerable anger and confrontation. So the fact that the university as a hierarchical institution has also become an extractive institution through the fee mechanism, trying to extract lots and lots of dollars. Sorry, that's that's the Australian currency too, the name of the Australian currency too, from the pockets of students or from their families, because a lot of families chip in to support students in a fee-paying situation. This is really a ghastly relationship to have front and center when you're trying to build educational relationships. How can senior academics support that without hypocrisy is a little tricky, since senior academic salaries and conditions are to some extent dependent on that flow of fee income in a private university, pretty much wholly dependent on that. They can support student organizations. They can lobby. They can use their own organizations to pressure universities to more equitable dealings with students. And they can take public positions in support of government policies that can relieve the problems of debt for students and over the long term move back towards a publicly supported university system. Now that might be difficult in the case of Columbia, which has been a private university for a very long time, the one which of course operates within a framework of public policy. But the capacities for university staff to speak out in support of students are always there.
Okay. All right. So we do have a question from Attila and another one from Magda. Perhaps I'll try and get both questions across. So Attila poses the following question. In evolving a socially just society, how can an engaged university partner with other tiers of education, especially in disadvantaged environments, in resource-poor environments, where the people living in conditions of precarity? And then Magda quotes a passage from your book and follows it up with a question around how you see the direction of the knowledge economy in 2021, especially in contexts of the global South. And she specifically cites Latin America, where neoliberal premises appear to have shaped what is taught and in what language.
Right. Yeah, great questions. Firstly, with Attila's question about partnering with other tiers of education, I think this is a very important process. And I have a little bit of experience in this area because part of my work, part of my academic career has been in a school of education, other parts in departments of sociology, but in the education context, because I've done a fair bit of work in the sociology of education, I have been involved in a variety of discussions and programs which are concerned with exactly that question of how in attempting to make the whole education system more socially just, we can work with, for instance, with schools in situations of poverty and whose communities are in situations of poverty and precarity. In Australia, for instance, I worked to some extent with the Disadvantaged Schools program, which was a national program with exactly that goal, which attempted to mobilize ideas and resources from the community itself, but also open ways of making contact between those communities and teachers of those schools with the resources of research or ideas that could come from universities. That what we were doing in Australia in that kind of program was by no means unusual. It's actually fairly common for education schools in universities to have that kind of interest and to orient at least some of their research to those very specific problems. And they can be acute because mainstream school systems also are either old-style bureaucracies or new-style surveillance and testing systems often have a one-size-fits-all approach to curriculum and pedagogy, and that can be totally inappropriate to the needs of strongly marginalised communities. So that's one kind of thing that universities can do. Another is to put serious resources into teacher education. That is one of the most important links between universities and other tiers of education ever since teacher education moved into universities, something that happened in Australia 50, 60 years ago. And has been, I think, a really important and creative development. But as I was remarking before, it can produce a one-size-fits-all model of teacher education, whereas actually we need multiple models and a considerable amount of resources in teacher education devoted to the issues for technical schools, primary schools, secondary schools, technical colleges, and so forth, who are dealing with working class and marginalised communities. There's an enormous range of things that universities can be engaged in there. It's very exciting work. It can be difficult. It's not necessarily going to make a lot of money for universities, so it's not necessarily what corporate style managers want, but it is socially very important. Turning to Magda's question, what would I see as the future of the knowledge economy in the global South? Hard to, I do try a little bit of crystal ball gazing in the final chapter of the book. I even imagine what certain certain universities might look like 10, 50, 200 years into the future. And that's something that I encourage people to do, to imagine concretely what a good university of the future might be like. Part of that is actually dealing with the issue that Attila raised, that is, how does the university relate to, become organically connected with a community which is not rich, which doesn't have large resources, but which can still have a constructive relationship with the university. And that, I hope, would be one of the ways that the knowledge economy in the global South would develop in closer or more organic connections with the knowledge resources and knowledge needs of local communities. That means rural communities as well as urban ones, because there are roles for universities in rural society, in agricultural based communities too. Although as university systems are at the moment, agricultural workforces, rural communities are among the most underrepresented in university student populations. Another direction I think is possible, and I would very much like to see expanding, is the experimental work that has been done in a number of countries around Indigenous-based communities. Something that's happened, for instance, in the Andean countries of South America, in Central America. There is a network of Indigenous and community-based universities, which has done some really very interesting work on rethinking curricula in the light of Indigenous knowledge resources and post-colonial social needs. Now, that has also happened in the Pacific. It's happened to some extent in Asia. It's happened there are very strong discussions of these issues across Africa. So there are bases for this kind of development, and I would hope those experiments can link up because they will reinforce each other. And some United Nations organizations and forums might be a place where those kinds of links will develop creatively. So I think the development, the encouragement and development of other knowledge formations across the global south, the establishment of stronger links to the communities that universities are serving, those are the developments I would like to see. But the question also mentioned the impact of neoliberal regimes on universities in the global south, and one has to acknowledge that too. The privatization of universities, the creation of league tables, dire as their intellectual bases are, they have become a policy instrument, which is having a really bad effect on university systems. So the overcoming of those impacts of the corporatization of the university world is not something that can occur only inside universities. It does involve larger social and political struggles to change the policy settings, involves struggles which I think have to be taken into international forums, the United Nations institutions, obviously, but also bodies like the OECD, which are not representative of global south areas at all. It's basically a club of the rich nations, yet that has taken over the international measurement of educational achievement in the global south as well as the global north. It's outrageous, I think, what's happened there. So those struggles have to be taken forward into international forums too. And more power to all the groups and agencies which try to do that.
Eu tô meio prontinho já. Eu só poder ir pro grupo do...
Okay, Clever, I had to mute you. I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Connell, for those responses. The next person is Jason on our list. And Jason was thinking about possible reactions to the futures that you envisioned in the last chapter of what a university could be, a good university. And what would you respond to people who would immediately say that won't work because A, B, C?
Right. I would say you're probably right. So let's get together and think of better plans. My little effort in science fiction is, just hoping to open up a dialogue, I guess. Or to encourage other people to do better, to imagine more bolder futures and more diverse and more fascinating possibilities. It's in no sense an attempt at providing a blueprint. I do offer a quite formal statement of what I think a good university is in a kind of philosophical sense. But what the practical realities will have to be worked out by the people on the spot at the time. And the more people can be encouraged to do that, the better.
Okay, thanks a lot. Michelle would want to pose a question directly to you. Michelle?
Thank you so much. And thank you, Raewyn Connell, for all of your excellent work. and for your theorizing on hegemonic masculinity and then revising it as hegemonic masculinities. And I kind of want to just think back to, like, in that spirit of kind of bringing together, I think some of the issues and also some of your just groundbreaking research too. I didn't realize you were thinking about the university until I saw the invitation for this talk. So I was so excited, and this has been great. I look forward to reading your book. And I think, like, bringing together some things, you know, as you're arguing about our need to rethink what a university is, it seems so necessary that we remember, you know, okay, so these issues are related, right? Like, a good university requires a movement that's a labor movement, that is a feminist movement, that's a decolonizing movement, that's an anti-racist movement. So how do we kind of do that work and build it out and maybe bring it in? And or are there examples you could point to where good universities have been built kind of trying to do that, you know, do those things? Because I mean, one of the things that's really holding us back at Penn State is it's just, frankly, it's very patriarchal. I mean, it really is. And so it's hard to even get started to make some of these things happen. And it's like one thing's related to another is related to another. So we need all these movements. So maybe I'll just leave it there. Oh, except to say, I also love your argument that the university is a producer of privilege and we need to recognize that. So then that begs the question too, how can we remake the university as a producer of equity and justice? And where to even begin?
Right. All very, very solid points and tremendously important. I don't have a what is to be done formula. I do have some sort of instincts, having been engaged in various attempts to change universities and suffering defeats as well as making progress at different times. And my instinct is always, you know, acknowledging the interconnection of all the barriers and difficulties that have to be faced. In the words of a terrific Swedish writer called Lundqvist, dig where you stand, start where you are, and you know, do what's possible in the immediate practical circumstance, but don't get stuck there, because the process should lead out, so that not only are you digging on the issues that immediately confront you in your own institution, your own community, your own country, but you are also making connections with people facing similar issues, differently configured perhaps, but with many common issues in other countries, in other communities, in other universities, so that building connections can provide inspiration, it can provide models of action, examples of how it can be done, inspiration when ground is gained, when good things are achieved. The more of those lateral connections, south-south connections, horizontality is possible, the more resilient a movement for change will become. I think a big university like yours in the global center of neoliberal wealth and power is a very tough proposition. And I don't wonder that you can feel overwhelmed by the difficulty of the task. And yet the United States, which is a country that I've worked in and lived in at various times of my life, is also a wonderful source of progressive ideas. It has a tremendous wonderful history of progressive education, of social mobilization. Even the last, national election in the United States is an illustration of that, because even the change, limited political change that has been achieved there was achieved by grassroots organizing more than anything else. So there are wonderful resources in the United States too, which can be important to us in other parts of the world. So don't lose hope. You have resources. We are part of your resources, I hope. And we will learn from what you do too.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Dr. Connell. I will take perhaps 3 questions in one go and move on to the after parties session. So there is a question from Samira who wonders how the university should be reclaimed, what the role of the non-academic staff should be in that process. Rob is interested in finding out what your views are on the influence of the Australian federal government, I imagine, on the university sector in Australia. So the influence of the federal government in Australia on the university system. And Christine is interested in your experience of building cross-border solidarities in knowledge production, knowledge dissemination. So for instance, perhaps in the Global South, any insights as to how cross-border epistemological solidarities can be forged?
Great questions still. I will try to be brief, so not to occupy our whole time together, but those all are worth serious thought. Samira's question, how to reclaim the university, and particularly the role of non-academic staff, whom I regard as really important in this process, and the analysis of the labor processes of knowledge and teaching, I hope, give some grounds for that in the opening chapters of the book. In Australia, we have a national tertiary education union, as you might remember from the first slide in my presentation, which includes both academics and non-academic staff. It's what we call an industry union. And the president of the Sydney University branch at the time of the strike was a non-academic worker in the university. So in many parts of the world, that is not the case. And if academics are organized and non-academic staff are organized, they're in separate organizations. I think that's a great pity. But where that is the case, it has to be a question of cooperation between the organizations, and perhaps the joint organization of non-academic and academic staff around particular campaigns, because both of them are affected very seriously by the bad management and toxic policies in university systems. They have very, very substantial common interests, I think. So I see non-academic staff as having a big role in shaping the future of universities, in designing better ways to do things, more democratic processes in decision-making and so forth. Rob's question about the influence of the Australian federal government on universities in my country. I could rave on for a long time about this because I'm very angry about what the federal government has done. It is interesting. 2 generations ago, the federal government had practically no role in Australian universities. The universities were set up by the state governments and funded by the state governments. But in the course of from the 1940s through to the 1970s, federal government influence on the public, federal government influence in the whole Australian system rose dramatically. Financial power was centred in the federal rather than the state governments, which is different from North America. And eventually, federal government took over the whole funding responsibility for the whole higher education system. It was totally funded from the federal government. And at that point, the federal government really controlled all university policy, despite the fact that the universities were technically state government foundations. So that was all fine while the federal government was trying to expand the university system, support the growth of research capacity, and support the movement of new groups into the student body, which it did up until the 1980s. But in the 1980s, our national government started moving towards neoliberal policies, towards privatization of public institutions, and that has accelerated since. In policies since the late 80s, our national government has reconfigured universities as if they were competitive firms, has reintroduced fees. It was a fee-free system. Reintroduced fees and increased the fees steadily, have had very high fees for overseas students, has treated overseas students basically as a revenue source, which has had an appalling misuse of Australia's international role, I think. We used to provide higher education for overseas students for free as development aid in our region, and now we are sucking money out of other countries through a privatized university model. I think it's really disgraceful and has had a dire impact on the universities as institutions in the passing up of the cultural learning that could have occurred on the part of the universities. Coming to Christine's question, my experience of cross-border solidarity is very informal, I have to say, though I have engaged in research cooperation of a more formal kind with knowledge workers on other continents, in Chile, for instance, in South Africa, in Brazil. We have shared in joint research projects, doing parallel investigations, sharing data, meeting, writing together, and publishing findings of social research. And that has been an exhilarating process, one that I've learned enormously from. On a more unofficial level, I guess I've visited as widely as I could. Coming from a privileged university system, I've been able to find funding for some of that travel, making personal contact, and then trying to maintain personal contacts through email and the current online systems. It's been a steep learning curve for me over 20 or 30 years, and tremendously important for my own intellectual development. I hope it's also been of value for the other people involved in my various networks. I hope so. It's convinced me that the development of global ranking systems and the formalization, if you like, of global hierarchy in the university system is essentially fraudulent and deeply misleading about the knowledge capacities of different regions of the world, because all of those global ranking systems have Harvard and MIT at the top, and basically what they do on a large scale is measure the amount of resources, the economic resources available to university systems. That's what those systems fundamentally do. The notion that that is a measure of quality of intellectual work or of education is ridiculous. So I'm very hostile to the ranking systems and appalled that governments take them as seriously as they do. So those are some of my experiences. I don't think that kind of work is easy. It's not quick, but those kinds of links are absolutely worth working to develop. It's exciting. It's mind-blowing in a way to encounter the intellectual capacities of people coming from a different political, social, cultural background. It's a wonderful experience.
Thank you very much for all the wonderful questions and for your replies to all those questions, Dr. Connell. We need to wrap up our formal session. I know there's still a few questions left. Dani and Shaila, if you can still stay for the short informal session, you can ask yourself the questions. So I'm handing over to Dr. Makoni to wrap up the this official session before I turn off the recording.
I'm going to sum up this session by quoting your own work, particularly the passages which I think capture the underlying energy in your argument. And this is now page 94, the last two paragraphs. And you write, the global workforce then has more room for maneuver than the bold facts of northern hegemony and southern extraversion might suggest. Researchers and teachers can respond to regional needs, develop distinctive research centers and agendas, renovate curricula, and create links with local communities, while staying within the research-based knowledge formation. It is also possible, though more difficult, for university staff to move outside the dominant knowledge formation, connect with other formations, and move towards epistemological pluralism. We should never regard the economy of knowledge as monolithic or immutable. It will certainly change. In what direction will be decided by struggles in which knowledge workers themselves, especially in the global south, will be central. Then on page 173, I think the penultimate paragraph, you say something that I think is quite relevant, not only to those at Penn State, but across the globe. It is a university's job to serve its society, not to agree with it. Where there are uncomfortable findings, it is the university's job to declare them. Intellectual labor involves a constant flow of questioning and critique. That is a crucial resource for societies facing difficulty and change, feeling their way into unknown futures. A good university inevitably is a bearer of oppositional ideas, an obstacle to privilege. I thought these two paragraphs captured well the arguments you were making in the rest of the book and today. Right. Okay, thank you. Vishna, it's up to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Connell, for